We are live.
Well, welcome. My name is David Smith, and I'm the president of the Forage Center for Peace Building and Humanitarian Education. And I am glad that you are with us today. Wherever you are, if you're in the United States, North America, overseas, we are just glad that you are spending some time with us this afternoon, this evening, this morning, to learn about humanitarian work. And I am going to turn it over to Jess Bonaway. Before I do that, is that this is part of a series that we do called Forage Center Conversations that we host periodically and we post on our YouTube channel. So Jess Bonham-White is our director. Dr. Jess Bonham-White is our director of education and training. I'm going to turn it over to her.
Hi, I'm Jess. As David said, I'm the volunteer director of education and training for the Forage Center. Very happy to be in that role. In my day job, I am a professor of criminal justice at Stockton University in New Jersey. So I'm on the East Coast, and I know that others are around. Once again, as David said, welcome wherever you are and whatever time it is. And I want to introduce and pass it on to Will for an introduction. So go ahead, Will.
Hi, everyone. My name is Will Neal. I am a program specialist at the Forage Center. I've been there, it'll be coming up on 9 years, which sounds very weird to say. During my day job, I'm a team development lead for Pepsi, which is not what I ever thought I would do. But I'm still very much involved in the cultural foundations of education and team development within those spaces. So I will now get over to Dave.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Jess. So I'm really honored to introduce our conversationists, our person we're going to chat with. And Laigaisse is a student of mine, actually, currently at the Carter School of George Mason University, but she is actually an exchange student. She is from France, and she will talk about her work there. But what really impressed us is the experience that she has had, particularly working with Ukraine refugees, which she did for several months in 2022, which I'm sure she'll share with us. And also her work with humanitarian work generally. This has been something that's a real passion for her. And I think her coming to the United States is opening that aperture a little bit and learning about how things are done in the United States that she can take back to her work in France. So I am going to leave it there and I'll turn it back to Jess.
Right. So I'm excited. First of all, I also volunteer for the American Red Cross. So I'm super excited. Always happy to have a fellow Red Cross colleague from around the world, from the global Red Cross movement as well. We'll chat a bit, but to get us started, so our audience is generally students, young professionals, young in service professionals, and of course those who have been in the humanitarian field for a while. So if you could give us a little bit of a background of how you got into humanitarian work, and again, understanding that you're in it in the French context. So this is going to be really interesting for American students and those who are interested to hear how a young French woman got into humanitarian work. So
yeah, definitely. I think the context is different in France, but basically I was a business school student, so I was not really at first interested by the humanitarian field. And then I started volunteering in different associations in France, and I really liked social work, generally speaking. So I started volunteering at the Red Cross, especially to become a first aid rescuer. So I did several trainings there, and I really loved the organization. And then all of a sudden, for one of the volunteering activity we had, which was hosting and welcoming Ukrainian war refugees, they were trying to hire 2 people as full-time employees, and I just got the job there. And I've been working at first with a 2-month contract, and then it has been extended, and in total I've been working for 6 months there.
that's really interesting. So a business student, a background. I hazard a guess that you're the first one I've spoken to with a business student, a background, but actually here in the US that when we think about emergency management and some of the ways that our students come into the field, right? Where we see business students is continuity of business and how do we keep things going in terms of the private sector during disaster, right, and during a crisis. So we do have business students out there who are interested, and if that's you out there watching, believe me, there's a place for you in our field. And so it's interesting that you talk about Ukraine, and of course we've all been watching it. What have you been doing? I've looked at your CV, but tell our viewers, and we'll sort of get some questions. What have you been doing with Ukrainian refugees in France?
Mm-hmm. So the Red Cross had different activities, different missions to welcome Ukrainian war refugees. So generally speaking, I coordinated and adjusted the missions and logistics for the reception of these war refugees. I had sometimes to manage volunteers, the planning, or the gym, which was an emergency housing center. And basically, we were hosting these people in a gym, and also welcoming them in the train station when they would arrive, and then sending them and transporting them to the gym. So ensuring that they'll be safe, and checking, administrative papers before hosting them, and then being sure that they have everything they need, basically. So it was just the emergency part of hosting the refugees. And then the French government did the second part, which was mid-term and long-term housing, for instance. So emergency housing was basically between 1 up to 3 days maximum. So we've been seeing a lot of people, but they didn't stay really long.
Mhm.
Will or David, any questions to go?
So I know that you talked about the housing, you talked about kind of being at the train station, kind of being that first person that kind of, excuse me, that interacted with them.
Yeah,
Yeah, like what responses did you get from those individuals when they saw you?
from the refugees when they first saw us.
Mhm.
It was different, I think, from the refugees because sometimes we had single persons, sometimes we had families, sometimes they were more desperate, sometimes not, sometimes they were just like used to whatever, because Ukraine is kind of far from France. So basically, when they reached us, they already traveled and been to several gyms or emergency housing centers. So they were, I cannot say used to, because I guess you can be used to it, but it was not their first time or their first country that they were crossing. Sometimes they were not staying in France. Sometimes they wanted to go to America, Spain, or Ireland sometimes.
Mm,
So yeah, it was also something important that we'd ensure something um with dignity, and seeing them for the first time, and trying to reassure them on how we'll treat them, and how they can have access to everything in France, for instance. And so we were working mainly at night at the train station. So if
mhm.
refugees arrived during the day, the train station would just kindly ask them to wait just some hours. So basically we're working especially at night to house them then in the gym.
What were the units? I must say units, but was it women with children mostly, older, younger? Could you generalize, or it was just a mix of all kinds of?
So,
Mm,
because of the geopolitical situation, we didn't have a lot of single men coming, because or just men in families. So I would say that we mostly received families, especially women and children.
Okay. And I'm also curious about language. English probably becomes really useful because Ukrainians are probably not speaking French, but some of them are learning a little bit of English.
Yeah, but most of them didn't really speak English, because we had like all types of refugees, and sometimes if people didn't get education, for instance, the older generations didn't speak English at all. So when the Red Cross hired the first 2 employees, so me and another colleague, they made sure that the other colleague could speak at least Russian.
Okay.
So she was Ukrainian, but she spoke Russian, so that was helpful, because I would manage to, for instance, translate what I needed to tell them, and then she would do the rest of the job.
Mm.
And I could sometimes try to speak English with them. It just depended on the education, the background of the refugees. And then when they hired 4 additional employees, there were only Ukrainian, also refugees themselves, or another colleague of mine was a Russian political refugee. So it was just like a big mix, but it was important to keep one fluent French-speaking person during the missions, to sometimes when we had to talk with the train station, when we had to deal with administrative papers, for instance, or even just a Red Cross worker, to know the principles of the Red Cross, to know what we could do or not in terms of safety, for instance, principles, values, humanitarian work, because my colleagues didn't have any previous experience at the Red Cross. So it was like a great mix that we did all together, and we were all complementary.
So you were training other volunteers at the same time you're actually working with refugees.
Yeah, so at first we started as 2 employees, then 5 employees, and at the same time we're working with volunteers who would help us, because there were sometimes too many refugees that we constantly were trying to find new volunteers to help us and to help the employee team. So we're working all together.
Thank you.
So at the Forage Center, we develop exercises, scenario-based, in real time sorts of exercises to run our participants through some of the experiences that they might have with, as you said, treating people who are displaced by war and conflict, first and foremost with human dignity, right? Which is our main mission. And it's interesting that you say that this was not the first stop that many of these individuals had on their way from Ukraine, and that they were going potentially to other places. So I guess I kind of have 2 interrelated questions. And the first would be one of the issues, and I know I do with this with the Red Cross too, the Restoring Family Links program. To what extent were individuals missing family members? Did families get separated in these moves? Did they get, one train to one place, one train to another? How organized were families in their leaving Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. So in Strasbourg, I think they just created that team of Restoring Links, Family Links, just a few months ago. So it was not in effect when I was there. But I didn't hear too many people being divided without wanting to. So sometimes we had maybe 1 or 2 cases of children who were still in Ukraine, and that was a big problem. But I'd say it was just some cases. And sometimes the families would split because of, I don't know, logistics, for instance. So at least this is not something that we're talking about.
Okay. And by the time they had reached France, what were some of their sort of first and immediate concerns? What were the things that when they got off the train, sort of this is what we need to know now type things?
So we had 2 situations, two possible situations. The first one was being the refugees want to stay in France, and the second one, the refugees want to keep travel to another place. So then, following what they wanted to, we were trying to give them some advice on what they should do or where they should go. But I would say the first thing they needed was having access to the gym. There they had Wi-Fi, they had internet connection, they had food, water. Sometimes they needed clothes that we didn't have, so we tried to manage with other Red Cross units, I would say, or other Red Cross cities near, so they could help us, for instance. But I think the needs of refugee were very different according to their age, their gender, if they were just with a family or not. And yeah.
I'm curious about education for children. Was there a provision for that, or an effort to get kids back into some sort of schooling?
So basically, as it was just an emergency center, we didn't have any. We just had a little place for children to play with toys, for instance. But then the French government would grant access to Ukrainian children to the schools, if they wanted to stay in France. So that was a thing. And then for the ones who wanted to keep traveling, I guess it just depends on what country they were going to.
I know one of the things that we tend to talk about a lot with the Forge Center and some of the work that we've done with emergency management is not necessarily the refugees themselves, but the community response to the refugees. Um, can you talk a little bit about how either the French nationals or other countries, people's, I don't want to say like accepted, but took notice of and approached the refugees? Like, was it positive? Was it sort of a mixed experience?
Yeah, it was, especially in Europe, generally speaking, Ukrainian war refugees were welcome in France, for instance. So there were different actors during my missions. There was the French government at a national, regional, or local scale, the Red Cross, and the train station, which was also like a public company and owned by the French government. So the French government, for instance, gave about 100 or 200 euros, which is approximately the same in dollars, for each French family who'd host Ukrainian refugees, for instance. Also, Ukrainian refugees would get a card for their monthly expenses, would get free housing at the Red Cross, then in hotels, or then in flats in Strasbourg, for instance, or in France. So yeah, I think it was a complex and comprehensive answer to their needs. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the hosting a community or the responding a community. Those are big. Those are big questions, because as different communities understand what is going on and what individuals are fleeing from, I assume that there may be a different response. I guess tell us a little bit from your side, your responses to being in this station at night and being the person, and your own growth or a journey or narrative or thoughts about your role in this and how it felt, and when did you feel frustrated, or when did you feel particularly fulfilled, or any and all of those things.
That's a lot. So that was really intense, working for so long at the Red Cross, and especially in this emergency situation, because then there is kind of a psychological background that starts to set in your mind, and it starts to be a lot. And sometimes during the 6 month, my manager had to take a break and I had to do her work at the moment. So I was just in charge of everything during the week, or I felt like I felt overwhelmed sometimes. So we had really beautiful moments with families, with, sharing, and people who would thank us a lot. But sometimes refugees don't thank us, because that's not what we're here for. We're not here to be thanked. So sometimes we would be frustrated because as part of our mission, we couldn't help them more or as much as we wanted to. Because of, I don't know, safety reasons, for instance, because we couldn't do more than just our jobs. So that was the frustrating part. Then I would say it's more about safety and legal reasons why we couldn't do more. And then for the beautiful moments, we had beautiful stories or amazing people that we met. Then I've been working at the housing center for 2 months. So I was there for 2 months, and then I started working at the train station for the last 3-4 months, I would say. And working there at night was complicated because we would do social work, generally speaking. And being a Red Cross employee with the Red Cross jacket, everyone thinks that you're a first aid rescuer. So in case they need anything, they'll ask you, but you can't help them. Fortunately, I was a first aid rescuer, but not my colleagues. So there was a little bit of misunderstanding also, because we were visible at the train station. People thought that we were doing social work, such as housing homeless people, other asylum seekers from other countries, other refugees, other migrants. And that was a problem, because we had to explain we're just here for Ukrainian refugees without sounding discriminating. And that was a big part, because a lot of other communities in France and in Europe have felt some type of racism between the double standards between Ukrainian refugees and other refugees, just like, or non-white refugees or non-Ukrainian refugees. And it was really tough at first understanding what we're doing, why we didn't have any other missions with other refugees, and then also explaining it really kindly and trying to be understanding about people fears, people feelings about this. And working in night there was like facing misery, I would say. And I was really surprised because I knew well my city. Like, I've been living in Strasbourg for almost 20 years, but I didn't see it that way at night in a public train station. Things just get totally different. You have people, homeless people, people dealing with alcohol problems, everything. And you're just doing social work, trying to help other people find a place to sleep, and being divided with, sometimes the gym was empty and people were asking us to sleep there. They were maybe from Belarusia or other countries also impacted by geopolitical concerns, and we'd had to say, I can't host you because of insurance problems, or because the government doesn't allow us to do. And it was heartbreaking because sometimes we had, but if we can't give it to everyone, we couldn't give it at all. But sometimes people didn't understand our work or what we were doing. And sometimes it would kind of get violent at times at the train station because of people drunk or making comments or trying to scare Ukrainian war refugees. So it was a lot working night with an extreme schedule. At the housing center, for instance, we would work really early in the morning by 6 or 7 a.m. until the afternoon, or at the train station by 6 p.m. to midnight or 1 a.m. And it just started to be a lot working there every day at a certain point.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting for us to think about in exercises and sort of others, that you have to remember that you're working within a context where you're providing the services, and maybe that context or that environment also brings up new issues to have to think about, or
Yeah.
as others are observing what you're doing, right? That's
Yeah, I'm always struck by the limitations that you're under, right? In that you would want to serve everyone, but then it becomes a bit of a cascade. That is, if then you say, well, I'm going to help this person out, somebody else sees it, and before long, you're serving people who are not part of your mission, right? So, people are transporting through Europe from many different parts. I mean, have you seen Syrian refugees and
Yeah, Afghan refugees a lot.
Afghan refugees? So you're
Yeah.
seeing other refugees simultaneously, but you can't help them, even though your heart wants to tell you you can't. That's a very hard place to be, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then also the fact that it was an emergency job. Sometimes we had new missions, sometimes it would stop. And at some point I wasn't even working on Ukraine missions anymore. I was just on another emergency housing center for homeless people. And so I think it was a big part of my job always, in it and it demanded me a lot of resilience to always constantly trying to adapt to a new context, because each week that I've been working there, we didn't know if our missions would keep going or not. So that was also just working in uncertainty all the time. And yeah, you can't do anything about it.
I
so.
guess,
Tell us a bit. Oh, Will, go ahead.
so thinking about kind of that, the wanting to help mentality, like what advice would you have for either first time, workers that want to get into the field, or first time volunteers that have a big heart that want to help everyone? Um,
Yeah, it's a big topic because overtime is not the same if you're working in a for-profit company or in an NGO, for instance. And overtime is not the same thing, because you're like, but I don't know, serve more food, or I can host more people, or I can do this if I just take just a little bit of my time, and it has a huge impact. And so sometimes you can be tempted of doing overtime or overwork every day. And sometimes I think you have to put limits to yourself and trying to see, I can do this. If it's a particular really emergency situation, maybe I can do this for a day or for a week, but I'm not going to do 2 hours or 3 hours more every day, because otherwise the quality of the service that I'm going to provide is going to decrease significantly. So also you have to take into account the quality of the work you're providing, and is it going to be the same for everyone, and is it more worth it to keep providing services if you're, I don't know, not being that kind or that understanding with people, or it's just not the same context, or you don't have the same patience with refugees anymore.
I have a question, maybe a little bit personal. I mean, what drew you to this type of work? I mean, we can all do different things to give people different things and help, but was there something that said, this is the kind of work that I want to do?
Yeah, so when I started the trainings at the Red Cross as first for first aid, I really loved the organization. So we had training about what was the organization, its work, what was it meant for. And when I went out of this training, I was like, this is where I want to work in my life. And just 1 or 2 months later, they asked me to hire me. And I said, yeah, of course, because I wanted to try it. Also, it was part of my gap year, so we're just trying to have experience, try to work a little bit, gain experience, try to see where I would like to work in. And I love social work and I love volunteering, the organization. So I just thought I'll do it. And I love that work and I love that job for the 6 months I've been there. And I would do it again if I could do it again. And it was an incredible experience to learn about social issues, about how to listen to someone, about how to try to avoid conflict, about my own resilience, weaknesses, strengths, and I learned a lot about myself as well.
What did you learn about yourself? I got with that question.
My limits mostly
Okay.
about my limits, about how to know when I'm not feeling good anymore, I'm not okay, because also because of the emergency nature of our work, we couldn't take a single day off for like 6 months straight. So we just had 2 days during the weekend, and it was not part of our rights, I would say, as employees, because it was just a punctual emergency work. So sometimes the manager, if she felt that we're not doing okay, she would still grant us a day, but that was it. And working for 6 months there without a real break was a lot. So I mostly learned about when I'm not feeling okay anymore, or when I have to stop, or um yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
But that important taking care of yourself. If you can't take care of yourself, you can't be good to anybody else, right? And making sure that you take care of yourself is important.
I did not really solve the issue of how to take care of myself and how to just turn the page and just grieve the experience. But I definitely learned for instance, the symptoms of my fatigue, or of when I can't do anymore. And that's really important, because when you're in it, you don't feel it. It's like when you have energy, or when you're doing an activity, you don't feel like you can't do it anymore, but then you stop and you're like, I should have stopped earlier.
Yes. Mhm.
So I think with that, and talking about your experience and what you've learned, tell us now what you're doing here in the US in your educational program. What are you studying, and how are your experiences informing the next step of your education?
Okay, so I'm just here for a semester in the US. So I'm a student at the Shore School and the Carter School of George Mason. So I took 3 courses, one with Mr. Smith, the one in conflict resolution and humanitarian crisis, leadership in nonprofit, and project management, because I thought it was a great choice that can help me do better work, or try to find something that can fit me even better between nonprofit leadership, and also I'm trying to link this with my business school curriculum, because I think society is evolving in business schools as well, because my business school, for instance, last year developed humanitarian training, humanitarian management training. So I was part of it, and we learned, for instance, logistics, but just not business school logistics, but logistics applied to humanitarian action, leadership applied to humanitarian action. And I just think we have a lot to learn from both sectors, between nonprofits, for profits, between NGOs and businesses, and how we can sometimes try to implement the tools or the practices that we have in the business sector to facilitate or to ameliorate the NGOs, or how they work, usually speaking. So I'm still not sure about the exact sector I'd like to work in, but I feel like, for instance, in the humanitarian course, I'm learning a lot, and it's complementary to humanitarian work. And I think you have to do them together, I would say, because they're complementary, and it gives me a lot of perspective on humanitarian work. For instance, on the some downsides of organizations, the downsides of humanitarian work. How can it be, because you have a relationship of power between the ones who help and the ones who are being helped. And I think the great thing that still made the Red Cross experience a good experience was the fact that I was constantly following trainings there, and they gave me a lot of background on how to help, what to do, what not to do, knowing that I did not have, I think, any knowledge in humanitarian work. I just did social work at that moment. So now I'm going to finish my semester at Mason, and I'll try to work in international cooperation and international development, because now I would like maybe to do something like an office job about project development, or being a program manager in humanitarian work, maybe. So I still have to study, and I still have to gain more experiences, but yeah.
So I have a question, but I wasn't sure if Will or David wanted to.
No, I don't have any more questions. I know you'll be going back to France sometime this summer, and I wish you the best going back. Would you be going back to Strasbourg?
Yeah, I will.
Okay,
So,
okay.
It's
And
a-
when do you finish your studies up at the business school that you were a student at?
So I'm trying to do my second year master out of the business school, just to gain more knowledge from a public university on the whole background of international development, because at that moment my business school and business school in France don't have this comprehensive teaching and knowledge about geopolitics, even though my background is in management applied to international relations, and I learned about geopolitics at the business school, but I didn't feel like it was enough for me to really go get what I wanted.
So, so what are you noticing, or are you picking up on, you've done education in France, you've done education here in the US, you've got an eye on a lot of perspectives. Thoughts about or responses to your, the American students in the class, and how they're thinking about humanitarian work, and interesting comparisons or contrasts, or things that you're seeing with sort of different perspectives at all?
So I would say that, for instance, the volunteers or the employees I've been talking to in France, they didn't have that much knowledge about the theory of humanitarian work, or the history of humanitarian work, or how much it is, how much it represents in the world. Because sometimes in an NGO, it's just, basic social and economic level of jobs. I had the least, it was just a job without, we didn't need that much education, for instance, to get that job. You just needed some experience in the NGO. So I don't think I can compare between American students that are studying it and French workers who did not study it at all. But I think it's really important to have a look at the whole system, the whole aid system, and knowing about aid work, just because it's what you do. And it's important to know that sometimes in other countries, in other NGOs, it's just different, and every NGO works differently, and there are a lot of ways more efficient or not to help people. So I would definitely, if I could give some advice, is learning about the background of the organization, about humanitarian work, generally speaking, about its downsides, and also choosing an NGO where they can provide you with training, such as the Red Cross, or something significant enough with people having different expertise or people knowing different practices to teach you, and not being just too focused on one axis. For instance, if you're working in a small organization, and yeah, I think that's it.
Well, I think that that speaks to kind of something that we've seen in the last couple of years with our work, is that we see participants and students have a lot of theoretical knowledge. Like they can quote you a textbook or quote you just some presentation somewhere, but then when they encounter it, whether it's in a simulation or whether it's in real life, they kind of freeze and they're like, well, I don't know what I can do right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to study, but then when you're on the ground, it's just a different thing. So what I would say for students is have a volunteering experience, even if it's not humanitarian work, if it's just about social work, about, I don't know, dealing with homeless people, about people having, I don't know, any type of social issues, because you'll learn about what it's like not to sacrifice yourself, but also being at the service of others, about listening to them, about the psychological, um, like how demanding it can be psychologically for you, and just being sure and making sure you really want to be there, because you can't know unless you do it.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, I think in the US now, sort of again, in my day job, I'm a professor, as many of us are at the Forage Center. We're either faculty members and adjuncting and all the things. And a lot of our students tend to be focused on the job they're going to get, or how are they going to make their money right now to be able to get themselves through school and things like this. And being able to stress that volunteering is still a very important way of getting job experience, even if yes, you're not being paid, but having that experience, almost to know like this is not what I want to do, is as important as, oh yeah, like this is great, it's exactly what I thought. It could be that you're going into something and going, oh, I had in my head it was this, I saw it in this movie, I saw it in this TV show, but then realizing, oh, the day to day, I'm going to have to work for 6 months without a day off at night in a train station, and talking with people and doing, that sort of service end of things. And also too, for the American students out there too, as you're in your university classes and thinking about the types of classes that have service learning projects and things like that, where you do go into the community and getting experience with your community. And I find it interesting that you said, I lived in Strasbourg for 20 years, but this is a new side of Strasbourg that I learned, right? Working at night, right? So even in your hometowns where, you've lived your life, seeing it at a different time, a different perspective, or in a different way that even the geography works, tells you a lot about, what your own biases were and perspectives were before you had to be at a train station in the middle of the night, right? So it's kind of interesting to get those experiences.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in France, the nonprofit sector is very closed. It's hard to get in there, especially if you don't have any experience, or if you're just a student, and if you do not study a proper humanitarian degree. So there are just a few jobs, and usually it's when people retire. There is no really creation of new humanitarian or NGO jobs. And I think volunteering is a great way to show the NGO when you're applying that you know about their organization, about their work, and especially if you can do, I don't know, for instance, I volunteered a little bit at Action Against Hunger, at the Red Cross, at the One campaign, and then I could say, okay, so I targeted different topics. I know what advocacy can be. I know what volunteering about food and poverty can be, and about first aid. And so that really gets me motivated to do this. And then it gives you more, not more purpose, but definitely they're going to see that you have more than just, I want to work there without, any anything relevant to it.
Yeah, that's great. One other question, sort of as we wrap up a bit. So once again, in the exercises, sometimes we look at how humanitarian workers interact with other agencies like the police or a local government or other agencies. Any insight or experiences, like, so when you were at the police station, when you were at the train station, were police officers around? Were they there to sort of help? Were they, what, or not? Like, interactions. I don't.
So I have two examples that I could provide about police officers. The first one was at the train station, because we're supposed to be neutral, just as them. But that night they were talking about, they were insisting on those double standards between Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian refugees, and how much Ukrainian refugees deserve more than other refugees to be welcome. And as if French government funds were more worth it if it was to welcome Ukrainian refugees, and how much the other refugees, for instance, the Afghan migrants who were in the train station, didn't deserve it, or didn't have the same education background, couldn't have any added value to the country, and how much they just, needed to go back. And it was really complicated to deal with, because I was not part of the conversation. And actually, they were talking to Red Cross volunteers who knew the Red Cross principles, but who were still talking and answering, when in fact we have to stop the discussion and say, we respect human dignity, neutrality, human rights, no matter where the people are from, So sometimes we would see people that were trying to talk about geopolitics and involve geopolitics in our missions, but we're just the French government allows us to do so, and we're just doing so, not because we think that others are not worth it or anything like this. The second one was especially at the Red Cross, when, for instance, police officers or any type of other security or military, for instance, destroy refugee camps, the Red Cross cannot be present because we don't want to be associated with this. So when we had the gym for homeless people in Strasbourg, one day they said that the police officers wouldn't be there when we would close it on the last day. And finally they were there. So we just stopped all activities and we said, we're not closing the gym. We just left. So definitely, especially being the only one on the ground, and I was almost the manager of the activities on the ground, without having that much knowledge of the Red Cross. I just knew the Red Cross volunteering for a few months. I really had to be aware of what we could do, or what we could or had to represent, because I had no other manager or direction with me next to me to say, oh yeah, you can't do this and you can't do this. But if I do something wrong, definitely the Red Cross is going to tell me, you were wearing our jacket and you did this and that's wrong, and you made a mistake. So I had to be really careful, and also trying to manage volunteers so they don't make any mistakes. And it also includes trusting them, but not too much, because you still have to check what they're saying to the refugees. I remember we had that one colleague, it was a Russian volunteer, I think, and we didn't know about it because we just had a French and English speaking team at that moment every time he was there. But he was talking about geopolitics and almost making fun of the Ukrainian refugees, but we didn't know it. So then we learned that we had to have at least 2 Ukrainian or Russian speaking volunteers, so we could prevent this from happening, for instance.
That's a really good lesson, and it's something to think about for anyone watching, going into the field, that when you're on a job, when you're doing something and you're representing a mission, what you do impacts everyone else working at that organization and at that mission, and it impacts the community, and it impacts a trust and legitimacy and sort of all of those things. And as easy as it may be to be, roped into conversations at 2 a.m. because you have no one else to speak to, right? Those sorts of things, those contexts and those experiences, a little thing can happen and really could impact the way that your activity goes or your mission goes or things
Yeah,
like
or
that.
even the funding, or even how people, the reputation of the Red Cross if something happens, and sometimes you just need very little for everything to explode, for instance. So it was just being very careful about the representation of the organization in particular was a huge psychological burden, because it was not just about the employees or the volunteers, but also, for instance, the security staff which was working with us in the gym, because we also needed to ensure that they weren't being discriminating or anything against the refugees, for instance. So there are a lot of actors and elements to take into account and to try to deal with, because the humanitarian answer usually is complex, and you have to take into account every other element's part of it.
Yeah, it's not an easy job.
The consequences of bad press, right? Just one little thing in such a volatile situation where, I mean, there's not consensus about how we should be responding to refugees. So if the Red Cross does one thing and the next day it's on the front page of a newspaper or a news article, then that's trouble, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, for instance, there was that one time when there were homeless people trying to sleep in front of the gym when it was not even full, and we had to ask him to leave, even if it was a public place. It was a court, like a basketball court, next to the gym. But my managers told me, for instance, if someone takes a picture with, the Red Cross gym and someone sleeping in front of it, like, we can get in trouble, or we can get in trouble if you show any type of attitude with people, and someone takes a picture of you or anything, or if you're not probably wearing your jacket or your Red Cross uniform. So you have to show exemplarity at all times, and it's a lot, to deal with every day.
Yeah, yeah. And that responsibility is part of the job.
Mhm.
Well, we've gone on for about 45 minutes. This has been a great conversation. I think, we're thinking about we have an exercise that's upcoming, which, we will all be at, but then also our future exercises, how we continue to adapt and think about particularly the sort of psychosocial types of things that humanitarian workers and peace workers go through, and trying to sort of provide these learning opportunities in a relatively safer space, so you can have those reflections and have those thoughts and things, wow, had I really been at a train station and not a fictional one that's, made by the Forage Center, what might I learn, or what did I learn about myself and things like that? Because, I think as important as some of the other, skills are, the planning, the logistics, and doing these sorts of things, as you've said, thinking about the psychological impact, the social impacts of all of these things are sort of as important to create a holistically effective and successful response, right? And then how we learn from that. So you've given us food for thought. I bet David and Will. I don't want to speak for either of you, but I have a feeling that you both would say, yeah.
There's a lot to think about, and once again, we have a kind of an Americentric way of looking at things, and it's great to learn from. I mean, and we're not at the front line of Ukrainian refugees. I mean, we have organizations that are receiving them, but not in the way that you're receiving them in Europe, working for the French Red Cross. So there's a lot of insight for us here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So this will conclude our Forage Center conversation. If you're watching this, please reach out and let us know what you think of our conversations, and stay tuned for more. So with that, I will end the recording.